The first orange survey stake stood beside my grandmother's oldest apple tree. I saw it before I saw my family. It was driven into the cold ground near the gravel entrance, its plastic ribbon snapping in the November wind. A second stake stood farther down the slope, then another. They formed a straight line toward the greenhouse where Grandma Ruth used to grow tomatoes through the first frost. Beyond them, 3 surveyors in reflective vests were measuring the field. A white pickup sat beside the barn. Site plans covered its tailgate. My younger sister Mallory stood over them with my father, pointing toward the north side of the property as if she were choosing where to put a backyard. My mother was near the farmhouse with Mallory's 2 daughters. Nobody looked surprised when I got out of my car. That was the first sign this had gone further than a misunderstanding. An hour earlier, I had been cleaning brushes in my classroom when Mr. Hanley called. He leased 6 acres behind the orchard for hay and grazing. I had known him since I was 10, but we rarely spoke directly because my father handled everything connected to the property. Mr. Hanley asked whether I had approved an access road through the east field. I told him I had not approved anything. He paused. Then he asked whether my father was still managing the property for me. For me. My parents had never described it that way. For 4 years after Grandma died, they told me the estate was still being settled. There were taxes, repairs, insurance problems, and questions about the farmhouse. Dad said he was preserving everything until the paperwork was clean enough to transfer. Whenever I asked for a timeline, he told me not to worry. Whenever I offered to help, he said the safest thing was to let him handle it. I crossed the grass toward the pickup. Dad intercepted me halfway. "You should have called." I looked past him at the survey crew. "So should you." He said a developer had offered to purchase an easement along the eastern edge of the property. The road would connect the county route to a planned subdivision. In return, the family would receive cash, utility improvements, and a finished residential lot. Mallory came over before I could ask who the lot was for. She said it would be near the north tree line, close enough for her daughters to remain near our parents and within their school district. Her divorce had forced them into a rental she could barely afford. The new lot would give them a permanent home. She spoke as though the foundation had already been poured. I asked who approved it. Mallory glanced at Dad. "Mom and Dad did. We weren't going to hold up the whole family waiting for you to make up your mind." My mother approached with the girls behind her. She said this was not the place to argue. Then she explained that Mallory had suffered enough instability. The children needed consistency, and the developer's offer might disappear if the family delayed. She touched my arm. "You have choices, Jenna. Mallory has children depending on her." I had heard versions of that sentence since we were teenagers. Mallory needed encouragement. Mallory needed another chance. Mallory needed help getting back on her feet. I could manage. I always did. A man in a navy jacket approached with a rolled site map. He introduced himself as Greg Nolan from Crestwood Development and asked whether I was Jenna Mercer. When I said yes, he stopped looking at my father. Greg said the preliminary title review identified me as the beneficiary of the Ruth Mercer Property Trust and the person whose authorization would ultimately be required for a permanent easement. Dad stepped between us. "She doesn't handle the property side of the family." Greg's expression tightened. He asked whether I had reviewed the proposed route. I told him I had learned about it less than an hour earlier. The surveyors stopped working. Dad called it a communication delay. Mallory said the route was only preliminary. Mom led the girls toward the farmhouse as if removing the children from the scene changed what the adults had done. I walked to the pickup. Mallory's proposed lot was outlined in yellow marker. A driveway curved toward the planned road. Her name had been written beside the drawing. The route cut through the Jonathan apple trees Grandma and I replanted after a storm when I was 16. It passed within yards of the old greenhouse before crossing Mr. Hanley's leased field. I asked when the property officially became mine. Dad said that was a technical question. I asked again. He said the trust had allowed him and Mom to manage everything until I was ready. Ready was one of his favorite words when he wanted control without a deadline. I taught visual arts at a public high school outside Columbus. That morning before Mr. Hanley called, I had approved a vendor correction on a $28,000 state grant. I managed purchase orders, student safety forms, and 3 annual contracts. At home, one missed credit card payment from when I was 23 still qualified as evidence that numbers overwhelmed me. Mallory looked toward the orchard. "You don't even want to live here." She was right. I did not want to build a house on the property. I did not want 12 acres, a failing barn, and a farmhouse that needed more work than I could afford. But not wanting to live somewhere was not the same as agreeing to let someone else divide it. I asked Greg whether the developer had already paid money. He said Crestwood had issued an option payment while the route was evaluated. Dad said the money had gone toward property expenses. Mallory said some of it had helped stabilize her situation because the future lot was part of the arrangement. No one gave me a number. No one explained why money connected to property under my name had been spent before I knew the offer existed. I pulled the nearest survey stake from the ground. Dad told me to put it back because the work cost money. I placed it across the tailgate. Then I told Greg that I was not approving an easement until I reviewed the trust, the option agreement, and every transaction connected to the property. Greg rolled up the plans. He said all field work would stop until authority was verified. Mallory stared at me like I had canceled construction on a house she already owned. "You're really doing this now?" I looked at the line of stakes through Grandma's trees. "No, you did this before I got here." I told my parents I wanted every record by 9 the next morning. For the first time that day, Mom looked frightened. Not because I was angry, because I had stopped asking for reassurance and started asking for specifics. The records did not arrive by 9. At 10, Dad sent tax statements and insurance invoices. At noon, he forwarded photographs of roof repairs and 2 hardware store receipts. None explained why he and Mom still controlled the property 4 years after the trust should have transferred authority to me. The attorney named in Grandma's original notice had retired. His former firm referred me to Simone Price, an estate and property lawyer. I met Simone in her downtown office the next afternoon. She read the trust without drama. Then she turned the page toward me and pointed to the management provision. My parents could control the property until I turned 27. After that, they were required to provide a final accounting and transfer management authority. I was 31. Simone explained that continued management was not automatically criminal. Paying taxes, renewing insurance, and arranging urgent repairs could be defended as preservation. Using the property to fund another family member without my knowledge was different. She asked whether Mallory knew the land belonged to me. I did not know. That question followed me back to school. The next morning, I stood in the supply room checking invoices for clay and canvas while my assistant principal asked whether we could reduce a rush shipping charge. We solved it in 5 minutes. Nobody called me emotional. Nobody reminded me of a bill I missed 8 years earlier. At the end of the school day, I drove to the farmhouse. Mallory's SUV was beside the barn. Children's coats hung near the back door. A plastic soccer goal stood in the yard. Through the kitchen window, I could see paper snowflakes taped to the glass. The farmhouse was not temporary housing. Mallory had turned it into her home. She opened the door but did not invite me inside until I asked whether she wanted the neighbors hearing us. The kitchen had changed since Grandma's death. The cabinets were cream. The old curtains were gone. A contractor's rendering of a modern farmhouse sat on the counter beside the subdivision map. Near the dining room window stood Grandma's narrow wooden art table. I had asked for it after the funeral. Grandma kept butcher paper, pencils, and a chipped tin of watercolor pans in its shallow drawer. I used to sit there while she canned tomatoes. She was the first adult who treated my drawings like work instead of something I would outgrow. Mom told me we could not divide Grandma's furniture too quickly because everything had to remain fair. 3 months later, the table appeared in a photograph from Mallory's house. I had called Mom then. She told me Mallory's daughter was using it and asked why I would take a useful desk from a child just because I felt sentimental. I let it go. Now the table stood beside plans for a house Mallory intended to build on my land. I asked how long she had known about the trust. Mallory said Dad told her Grandma placed the property under my name because I was older and more organized when the paperwork was prepared. That explanation made Grandma's decision sound accidental. I asked whether she knew the management deadline had passed. Mallory said our parents always intended the property to support both daughters. I asked whether the trust said that. She said families did not operate like corporations. I glanced at the contractor plans. Apparently, we operate like developers. Mallory said the lot would not cost me anything. Crestwood would build the road, improve utilities, and raise the value of the remaining land. She would receive one residential lot, not the entire property. I reminded her that she had selected the section nearest the orchard and greenhouse. She said I had no plan for it. I had asked Dad repeatedly whether I could begin cleaning the greenhouse. Each time he told me the estate was unresolved or the structure was unsafe. The weekend after his last refusal, Mallory held a birthday party there. I had complained that time too. Dad said the party was only one afternoon and accused me of treating every family decision like a territorial dispute. After enough conversations like that, I learned that raising the issue produced the same result as staying quiet, except everyone became angry with me. Mallory remembered only the quiet. You never complained before. I did, I said. You just never had to listen. Her face tightened. I asked whether she knew I had not approved the development. She said Dad believed I would understand after I saw how much the arrangement helped everyone. I asked again. This time she admitted she knew I had not been told. She did not apologize. She said she had not believed I would say no. Mallory did not think the property was hers. She believed my answer would eventually become whatever the family needed. I asked about the option payment. She said Crestwood paid $40,000. Dad used some for taxes and property expenses. The rest helped with her business debt, divorce costs, and repairs to the farmhouse because the house and future lot were supposed to become hers. She had paid for electrical work herself after Dad promised she would not lose the investment. That mattered. It meant our parents had not only taken from me, they had made promises to Mallory using something they did not control. On the counter beneath the contractor rendering was a printed email from Crestwood. The subject line mentioned the option payment. I photographed it. Mallory watched me. Then she said, "You're going to make this ugly, aren't you?" The trust had been ignored. Money had been spent. Her future house had been designed. The orchard had been marked. But in Mallory's mind, the ugliness began when I demanded a choice. Before I left, I told her no contractors were allowed onto the property and no additional work could continue. She said I could not issue orders in her home. I looked around the farmhouse. That's the problem. Everyone decided it was yours before anyone asked me. I drove away before she could answer. 10 minutes later, my phone lit up with a message from Mom. Mallory is already fragile. Please don't make her feel like she has nowhere to go. I had not threatened to evict her. I had only asked what they had done. My family was already defending Mallory from consequences I had not imposed. The option payment had been $40,000. $9,000 went to overdue taxes and insurance. Those were legitimate expenses. $12,000 went to the lender behind Mallory's event decor business. $6,000 paid part of her divorce attorney's retainer. $4,000 was transferred into my parents' household account under family carrying costs. The rest went toward utilities, fees tied to the development proposal, and work at the farmhouse. There was no distribution to me. There was no final accounting. There was no notice that income connected to the property existed. Dad said the money had been used responsibly. He described Mallory's debt and legal fees as temporary family needs. I asked why my property had become the emergency fund. He said because the money was available. That answer explained years of family decisions. Mallory's problems did not have to be connected to me. I only needed to possess something that could be redirected. When I was 23, I missed one credit card payment during the gap before my first teaching paycheck. Dad helped me set up automatic payments. For years afterward, that one mistake appeared whenever he wanted to describe me as financially unreliable. Mallory had closed a business with 5 figures in debt and missed mortgage payments during her separation. Those were circumstances. My late payment was personality. Simone sent my parents a written demand to preserve all records, stop discretionary transfers, and confirm that no permanent agreement would move forward without my approval. I went to the bank after work. The branch manager showed me the account structure and confirmed that Dad and Mom were still listed as authorized managers. I was angry enough to want every door closed immediately. I ordered a complete withdrawal freeze. It felt like control. The next morning, it became a problem. Mr. Hanley called from the pasture. A pump serving the livestock trough and part of the farmhouse well had failed. Dad had previously agreed that the property account would cover half the repair. The contractor's payment had been rejected. I drove directly to the farm. Temporary water tanks sat near the fence. Mr. Hanley and his son were running hoses between them, while cattle crowded the far side of the field. He did not yell. He explained that the animals could not wait for our family to decide who controlled the bank. I had spent days insisting that everyone respect my authority. My first use of that authority had affected someone who had no part in the conflict. I approved the repair from my phone and called the branch manager while standing beside the failed pump. The revised policy allowed verified emergency maintenance, taxes, insurance, and utilities. New contracts, family transfers, and discretionary expenses required my written approval. I apologized to Mr. Hanley. He showed me his lease. Dad had renewed it 6 months after his authority should have ended. The rent was below market, but Mr. Hanley had repaired fences, removed storm-damaged trees, and watched the buildings. He had not exploited the arrangement. He had trusted the person presented as the decision-maker. "Your father always said he was waiting on somebody else," he told me. "Don't start doing the same thing." We revised the lease directly. By the time I returned to the school, Dad had already announced the rejected payment in the family group chat. He wrote that my impulsive freeze nearly left livestock without water. Mallory replied that this proved he had been right to continue managing the property. Mom asked everyone to calm down, then wrote that Jenna needed to understand land management affected real people. She wrote my name in the third person, although I was in the thread. I replied with 3 facts. The repair had been approved, the policy had been corrected, and no additional transfers would go to Mallory without my consent. Mom called immediately. She said there was no reason to humiliate my sister. The group contained only the 4 of us. I asked who the audience was. She changed the subject and said Dad wanted a family meeting before lawyers made everything hostile. The meeting took place at my parents' suburban house, not the farmhouse. Family photographs covered the living room wall. Most of the recent ones were of Mallory's daughters. My college graduation picture still showed me in a frame from 12 years earlier. Dad had prepared a proposal on a yellow legal pad. Crestwood would receive the road. Mallory would receive the finished lot. I would retain the farmhouse, barn, and remaining acreage. The money already spent would not be repaid because it had supported family needs and preserved the property. Mallory could remain at the farmhouse until her new house was complete. Dad called it a compromise. It was the original arrangement with my name added at the end. I asked about Mallory's business loan and legal fees. Mallory said the money came from an asset our parents managed for the family. I asked why income from property under my name belonged to her. She said she had lived there, helped with repairs, and relied on Dad's promises. She produced receipts showing she paid $6,500 for electrical work after Dad told her the farmhouse and future lot would become hers. For the first time, I saw how our parents had positioned us. Mallory had not invented that promise. Dad had given it to her. I told her the documented electrical work should be reimbursed. She looked surprised. Dad said that proved the family plan could be adjusted. I told him it proved the opposite. Mallory deserved reimbursement for money she spent based on his false promise. She did not deserve ownership of something he had no authority to promise. Mom said reimbursement would not give Mallory a home. I said the girls would not be forced out overnight. Mallory could have a 6-month lease at a reduced rate. She would pay utilities and could not renovate, invite contractors, promise land, or represent herself as an owner. There would be a fixed move-out date. Mallory called it cold. Dad brought up the pump. He said one day of control was enough for me to interrupt an essential repair. I admitted the mistake before he could build a speech around it. I explained how I corrected it and changed the policy. He said repairing a mistake did not make me qualified. I asked what qualified him to use the trust account for Mallory's divorce. He looked at the legal pad instead of me. Mallory said I had always liked playing the responsible sister. She said helping people gave me a reason to feel superior later. I asked whether that was how she remembered the months I helped with her daughters during the separation. She said I had volunteered. I had. I had also once declined because I had a Saturday school exhibition. Mom called back 15 minutes later and said Mallory was falling apart. The girls needed stability and family had to come before a student art show. I kept the girls. My principal covered the event setup. That was how the pattern worked. I did object sometimes. The objection became the offense. I told Mallory I had not helped because I wanted a debt. I helped because she was my sister. But every time I helped, I said, you all treated it like proof that I could give more. Mom said I was dragging old resentment into a practical decision. I told her the practical decision had been built from the same assumption. Mallory needed something I would survive without it. Therefore, asking me became optional. Dad pushed the legal pad toward me. I folded it once and placed it back in front of him. Then I told them the easement would not proceed under the current plan. Mallory would receive the 6-month lease and my parents' management authority was ending. Mom said this was exactly why they had waited to tell me. The room went silent. She tried to correct herself, but she had already said it. They had not hidden the plan because I could not understand it. They had hidden it because I might refuse. My parents did not surrender control after the meeting. Dad sent Simone an accounting that charged the trust for hundreds of hours of labor, mileage, phone calls, and strategic planning. The total nearly erased the money redirected to Mallory. Some of his work was real. He had paid taxes, renewed insurance, and arranged repairs. I agreed he should receive reasonable reimbursement for documented expenses. But he had also billed the property for meetings about Mallory's divorce, visits to her event business, and discussions about the house she planned to build. Anything connected to Mallory had been renamed property management. Simone returned the accounting with questions beside almost every page. Mom began calling relatives. She told them I was canceling an agreement that would increase the land's value and forcing Mallory from the only stable home her daughters had known that year. She did not mention that the agreement had been negotiated without me. Mallory refused to sign the lease. She sent photographs of the girls' rooms, their drawings on the refrigerator, and the apple tree outside the kitchen window. Beneath one image, she wrote that they had finally started feeling safe. I sent her the lease again, along with 2 rental listings in the same school district. I would not make the girls homeless. I also would not let their bedrooms become permanent authorization. Mallory responded that Dad had promised her a house, not 6 months of reduced rent. So, she turned to him. The confrontation happened at my parents' house 2 evenings later. I was not invited, but Mallory called me afterward and told me more than she probably intended. She asked Dad to borrow against his house and fund the down payment he had promised. He said retirement was too close. She asked whether she and the girls could move in with our parents. Mom said the house was not designed for 3 additional people. Mallory asked them to guarantee another loan. They said they could not endanger their credit. For years, my parents had appeared endlessly generous because they kept paying with resources that belonged to someone else. My weekends, Grandma's furniture, the property account, the land under my name. When Mallory asked them to sacrifice something that was actually theirs, generosity developed limits. She called me that night from a grocery store parking lot. For the first time, she sounded less angry than exhausted. She said Dad had convinced her the property was effectively meant for both of us. He said Grandma used my name because I was older and easier to place in the trust documents. He promised the farmhouse and future lot would solve her housing problem. She had rejected another rental based on that promise. For several minutes, I understood her anger. Then she told me when she learned the truth. 3 months before the survey, she had asked Dad what would happen if I said no after discovering the property belonged to me. He told her I would come around when I understood how much the girls needed the land. Mallory knew before the stakes went into the ground. She knew before she hired the contractor. She knew before she stood beside the pickup and told me the family could not wait for my decision. Our parents had misled her first. Then, she chose to continue once the deception benefited her. That distinction mattered. I told her I would credit every documented improvement she had paid for. The rest would have to be resolved through the accounting and lease. She said I could afford to be principled because I was not the one losing anything. The entire conflict existed because everyone had decided I could lose things without it counting. Crestwood requested a formal authority review before abandoning the project. The meeting took place in a small conference room at the company's regional office, not at the orchard. Greg attended with Crestwood's title consultant. Simone came with me. Dad and Mom arrived together. Mallory sat beside them. The county planning office did not attend. Angela Foster had already notified Crestwood by email that the county would not process the access application until valid owner authorization was established. There was no family debate for an official to referee. The title consultant asked one question: who had legal authority to approve the easement? Simone presented the trust provision and the expired management date. Dad presented his history of maintaining the property. The consultant said maintenance did not extend authority. Crestwood suspended the option immediately and gave the parties 10 business days to resolve representation. If valid approval was not provided, the proposed route would be abandoned, and any remaining option funds would stay frozen pending accounting. The meeting lasted 23 minutes. No one read private messages. No one gave a speech. The company simply stopped treating my father as the person who could answer for me. In the parking lot, Mallory accused me of humiliating the family in front of strangers. I reminded her that strangers had been brought into the plan before I was. Dad said we still had 10 days to save the agreement. I said there was nothing to save unless the plan changed completely. Mom asked whether I wanted to see Mallory and the girls suffer. The question was familiar. Nobody asked whether I wanted to lose the orchard, the greenhouse, or control of the property. My suffering had always been framed as capacity. Mallory's was treated as emergency. That evening, Dad called a final family meeting. He said no lawyers, no developer, and no outsiders. Just the 4 of us. He believed the old room and the old roles might still produce the old answer. I agreed to attend. Not because I planned to negotiate the land, because after years of accepting whatever story they told about me, I wanted to hear what they would say when there was nowhere left to hide. The final meeting took place in my parents' living room. Dad's yellow legal pad was gone. This time, he had a typed proposal. The road would shift farther east, away from most of the orchard. Mallory's lot would become smaller. I would receive the remaining option cash and formal control of the property after the agreement closed. Mallory would sign a repayment note for part of the business loan. Dad called it the last reasonable solution. I read the first page and put it down. Even reduced, the lot still went to Mallory. The road still crossed property I had never agreed to develop. The proposal still treated my consent as the final administrative step in a decision everyone else had made. Mallory said she had already lost money because of Dad's promise. She had paid for repairs, rejected a rental, and told her daughters they would have a permanent home. I said I would reimburse the documented electrical work and honor the 6-month lease. She said that was not the life she had been promised. I agreed. Then I reminded her I was not the person who promised it. Dad said blaming him did not solve the problem. I told him giving away my land had never solved it either. Mom said the family needed to stop attacking one another. Then she turned to me and asked whether I could live with myself if Mallory's daughters had to move again. That was how Mom mediated. She declared neutrality, then handed me responsibility for Mallory's consequences. Mallory said I had always been able to leave. I went to college. I built a career. I lived 45 minutes away. She stayed close to our parents and dealt with the family I had walked away from. It was the cleanest version of the story they told about me. I asked whether staying nearby gave her the right to accept my property. She said I was reducing everything to ownership because ownership was the only advantage I had. Then she said I had never understood what it meant to need help. For a moment, I said nothing. I remembered the art table, the weekend I tried to keep for my students, but surrendered because Mallory needed childcare. The months I delayed dental treatment while listening to my family describe me as the daughter who did not need support. I did not need 10 examples. The pattern had already repeated enough. I understood a long time ago that you were favored, I said. Dad tried to interrupt. I kept going. I understood it when one mistake became my personality and every crisis of Mallory's became an exception. I understood it when Mom said Grandma's table had to stay fair, then gave it away. I understood it every time I said no, and you turned the no into proof that I was selfish. Mom said I was rewriting the past. I told her I had spent years doing the opposite. I had softened it, excused it, told myself Mallory needed more and that I could survive with less. Mallory said helping her did not make me morally superior. I never wanted to be superior. I wanted you to ask. The room became quiet. I helped because you were my sister. I stayed quiet because those were my nieces. But every time I let something go, all 3 of you treated it like permission to take the next thing. Dad said emotion did not change the economics of the project. I opened my phone. Simone had obtained the complete email chain from the records Dad produced during the accounting demand. I read only 2 messages. Mallory had written, "What if Jenna says no once she finds out the land is hers?" Dad had replied, "She won't blow this up once she sees how much your kids need it. Get the lot secured before the developer changes the offer." Mallory looked at Dad before she looked at me. Mom said the messages sounded worse than the intention. Dad said preliminary planning was not a final transfer. I asked why no one had contacted me once Mallory realized I did not know. Mallory said she trusted Dad. I asked why she hired a contractor after asking what would happen if I refused. She had no answer that did not make the choice clear. Our parents had lied to her. Then she helped continue the lie. Dad said he knew how I reacted when Mallory needed something. I asked what that meant. He lost patience. "You make everything harder whenever she needs help." The sentence came out before he could reshape it. That was the truth under every accusation about my anxiety, my career, my distance, and my lack of children. I was not difficult because I lacked judgment. I was difficult because I could say no. Dad had spent years turning my boundaries into flaws so the family would not have to respect them. I told him the Crestwood agreement was over. Mallory asked whether I had already decided before coming. I said I had decided the moment I learned the plan depended on hiding the owner. Dad said I was punishing everyone for a communication mistake. I reminded him that a mistake did not include a strategy for pressuring me after discovery. Then I told them what would happen next. My parents' authority over the property would end formally. Mallory would receive credit for the electrical repair, a 6-month lease, and no ownership interest. The trust account would be reviewed. Legitimate property expenses would be paid. Personal transfers would be repaid. There would be no access road through the orchard. Mom asked whether there was anything they could say to change my mind. I thought about it. No, but there were a lot of things you could have said before you made the decision without me. I left before they could turn the meeting into another round. The next morning, Simone sent Crestwood written confirmation that I would not approve the route. Greg acknowledged the withdrawal. 2 days later, the survey crew returned to the orchard. I watched from beside the greenhouse with Mr. Hanley. The workers removed the orange stakes one by one. My family was not there. No official watched, no one apologized. The proposed road simply disappeared because the people who planned it no longer had the power to answer for me. The first stake came out beside Grandma's oldest tree, then the second, then the third. For years, my family had relied on the same calculation. Mallory would ask, my parents would decide. I would survive. That calculation ended before the last stake left the ground. The aftermath was shorter than the fight. My parents agreed to replace the money they had redirected rather than face a court-supervised accounting. Dad received credit for documented taxes, insurance, and legitimate maintenance. Mallory received credit for the electrical work she had paid for. She signed the 6-month lease and a modest repayment agreement. Then she moved into a townhouse in the same school district. The girls kept their teachers and friends. They lost the farmhouse, not their stability. When I inspected the empty house, Grandma's art table was gone. I called Mallory. She said her daughter was attached to it. I reminded her that I had asked for it after Grandma died. She was quiet for a long time. 3 days later, the table appeared on the farmhouse porch. A yellow sticky note sat on top. This one was always yours. It was not an apology. It did not repair our relationship. But it was the first time Mallory returned something simply because it belonged to me. I carried the table into the greenhouse. A month later, she called while I was grading student portfolios. Her car had broken down before one of the girls' school events. She began the old way. Mom said you might be able to... I stopped her. What are you asking me? There was a pause. Then Mallory asked whether I could pick up her daughter if the repair shop kept the car overnight. It was a request, not an assignment, not a decision already made by our parents. I checked my schedule and said yes. I helped because I wanted to. That difference was the boundary. I had known for years that Mallory was favored. What changed was not my awareness. It was my willingness to keep paying for it. If your family kept giving your share to the sibling who supposedly needed it more, how long would you stay quiet?